This is John Musgrave. Thanks for clicking on the podcast. If you like this content or like this episode, please click the like button or even subscribe. Thanks very much. All right, so you got some sheets in front of you that you've been looking at or are just looking at now. We'll head through them. All right, so let's do our profits sheet. So what color did I do that on?
Yellow.
Okay, so goldenrod. Yes, there's somebody who's worked in an office. You know that color, goldenrod. Okay, so goldenrod. Now turn those over to the questions. Well. Actually, turn it back over. Let's do the picture side first. Okay, so in the minor prophets, we start with whom? Yeah, and how many minor prophets do we have?
12.
We have 12. Yes, and if you didn't know that, it's on your sheet. How many major prophets are there?
5.
Yeah, 5. And so we start with whom again? Hosea. Yep, and what's the hose have in the middle of it? Yeah, the hose has in the middle of it a hole. So we'll look at that there, and there's that hole. But it's not a hole, is it?
No, it's Joel.
It's Joel, yes, not a hole, but Joel. So Hosea and Joel is our first 2 minor prophets. So we got 1, and we got 2. Then we set our hose back there with the hole in it. And what happens with this hole? Who sees this hole and can't resist? A moose, yeah, sees a hole. So there's Hosea, there's Joel, and then there's our moose, and he sees the hole, and what's he do? Yeah, the moose jumps into the hole. But it's not a moose, is it? It's Amos, yeah. There we go. So Amos is our 3rd minor prophet, and Amos jumps through that hole there, and so there we go. We got our first through Hosea, Joel, Amos, and Amos goes through this hole, and looks pretty perilous for him there. And he's going to crash his head down on the hard ground, but he's not going to crash his head on the hard ground, is he? Why not? That's right, because there's going to be a bed down there for him to land on. And so there's a bed, but it's not a bed, is it? What is it? Obadiah. There we go. So there's our 4th minor prophet there. So we got a hose with a hole. A moose goes through it and lands on a bed. Okay, so there are your first 4 prophets there. A little picture line going on for you here.
I have a quick question. I forget.
Yes.
Why is the bed connected to Obadiah?
Obed. So it's a bed, and so we think of Obadiah, even though it's an AD instead of an ED. Yep. So the moose has landed, or has landed. Amos has landed on the bed, but he can't rest for long because something's going to happen to him. Yeah, that's right. Out of the sky, boom, comes a whale. So you thought a moose was big on a bed, but a whale's even bigger. And so the whale comes along, and the whale represents whom? That's right. So the whale is, say it? Say it! Come on, Sam Kinison fans. Jim and I were talking about Sam Kinison Thursday. So Jonah, okay, so the moose is on the bed, but the moose gets squashed by the whale. And when you think of a whale, you think of Jonah. So there we are at our fifth prophet. We've had 5 events here. So there's Jonah there, and that's an unusual thing to see a whale on a bed. So what do you do with the whale when you see the whale on the bed? Yeah, you interview him, and when you're interviewing him, you get your best interviewer, and that's who? Mike. And he's holding a what? A mic. Okay, so the whale, Jonah's getting interviewed. When you get interviewed, you've got a mic, and so that's what minor prophet. Micah. There we go. So Jonah's on the bed, and a mic gets put in his mouth, okay, to start speaking. And so that's our 6th prophet there, Micah. But this whale, Jonah, has been in the water, and he hasn't been conversing much. He's kind of antisocial. He's an introvert. And now he has to do an interview. And so he's asked a question. Before he speaks, what's he do? He clears his throat. And how do you clear your throat? Yeah, that's right. So you clear your throat. Here are the questions that come at him. Jonah, what's it like for a whale to be on a bed? Jonah, what's your opinion of Nineveh? Jonah, feeling the spotlight and preparing to answer, clears his throat and says, Okay, so when you start to be interviewed, you go, so that's our next, that's our 7th. So we're already at 7. Okay, we got 12 altogether. Our 7th minor prophet is Nahum. And then after he does this interview, he's not used to speaking and all. And so what's he feeling like when this interview comes to an end? He's tired. Yeah, and so he's tired, and he's heard from his chiropractor he's not supposed to sleep on his belly because it's bad for your neck. And so what's he do? Yeah, he flips over. He flips over on his back to take a nap. And so he flips over on, what's the arrow pointing to? His back. But that's not his back, is it? That's Habakkuk, not his back. Okay? So Habakkuk. So after he clears his throat for that interview, he's worn out, again, because he's antisocial, and as Jonah was. And he flips over on his back to get some Z's, to take a nap. So he clears his throat and does the interview, and then flips over on his back to start sleeping. Okay, so Habakkuk on his back to start sleeping on the bed. But then, as he's sleeping, he thinks he's getting a good rest, but he's not going to get a good rest because what's going to come along and blow him off the bed? A zephyr. Yeah, and a zephyr is, now you know, is a west wind. The zephyr's or west wind is called a zephyr. And so as he's there, lying on Habakkuk, his back, he gets blown off the bed by a west wind, a zephyr. And what minor prophet do we have starting with Zeph? Zephaniah, yeah. And so here's the west wind, which is a zephyr, and this is representing, the zephyr represents Zephaniah, and it blows him off the bed. There he goes. Okay, so we're up to number 9, Zephaniah, the west wind. And he gets blown, you see here, here into this space there. And when he looks up, he sees in that space, he's blown into that office space, and he sees a guy hug a guy, doesn't he? See those 2 guys in the office. So he gets blown into this office space, high-rise, office space, in a skyscraper there. And he sees these 2 guys hugging. He sees one guy hug another guy, but it's not really hug a guy. What is it? Yeah, it's Haggai there. Okay, so he comes in. He's been blown in by the west wind, and he sees a guy hug a guy. That's the first thing he sees in this office space to which he's been blown in. But it's an office space. So what kind of guys are hugging and getting hugged? Executives. These are two executives. So the guy who's hugging the guy, it's an executive hugging an executive. And in the word executive, you have Zech, and that reminds us of which minor prophet? No smiling. It's completely serious. Zechariah. There we go. So we're up to the 11th. Isn't this great? So we got an executive, and it's the Zech there that we take. Zechariah there. So we just got one more to go. But these two executives, the one executive is hugging the other executive. The guy's hugging the guy, but it's an executive hugging an executive, we found out. It's ultra competitive. They're both shooting for CEO, Chief Executive Officer. Right now, they're just underlings. And so what's the one do to the other? He pulls out what from his suit coat? A mallet. He pulls out a mallet to knock out this guy or to kill this guy. And it's not really, well, here's the mallet that he pulls out, unbeknownst to his other executive friend. And that mallet becomes a weapon. There we go. But it's not really a mallet, is it? What minor prophet sounds like? Yeah. Not mallet, but Malachi. There we go. So there you go. You got your 12 minor prophets there. Lily's still smiling and laughing. So there we go. 12 minor prophets. Turn your page over. So now let's answer these questions. Question number 1, Mallory, would you read that for us?
A bed being landed on by a whale tells me that.
Okay, and so I arranged these. I worked on them for a while so that the left side would always be the first prophet. So the first word underlined, bed, will be the first prophet, and the second line or second word underlined, whale, will be the second prophet. Okay, so a bed being landed on by a whale reminds you that or tells you that what? What's the bed? Obadiah precedes Jonah. Okay, so if you're flipping through your Bible and you gotta find Jonah and you open up and it's on Obadiah, you say, wait, what lands there? So there we go. Obadiah precedes Jonah. Okay, number 2, Betsy.
A hose with a hole in the middle tells me that.
Okay, so the hose is whom? Hosea. With a hole in the middle tells you? Joel. So that Hosea precedes Joel. Okay, and we're just going through our little mental picture, our little mental story in our minds. Number 3, Jim Smith.
An executive being killed by a mallet tells me that.
What?
Zechariah
Zechariah
precedes Malachi.
Malachi. So Zechariah precedes Malachi. So if you need to find Malachi, or you need to find Zechariah and you land in Malachi, which is right, which you do often when you're trying to find Matthew. At least I do. Looking back for Matthew and it opens up to Malachi. But I'm looking for Zechariah. I say, oh wait, the mallet hits the executive. I just need to go one back there. Or vice versa. Okay, number 4, Bob.
After clearing his throat, a whale flips on his back. This tells me that Nahum precedes Habakkuk.
Yeah, Nahum precedes Habakkuk. Okay, because the clearing of the throat happens. That's the interview that he gets tired at, and so he flips over onto his back to take a nap. So Nahum precedes Habakkuk. So these are consecutive books here. All these are consecutive. Jim, number 5.
A hole pierced by a moose jumping down through it tells me that Joel precedes Amos.
Yeah, Joel precedes Amos. Okay, so in your mind, you can just go through this story. If you're in Joel, and you say, well, what happens next? Well, the hole gets pierced by by the moose. And so Amos is coming up next. Okay, next 6, Christina.
A garden hose reminds me of the first minor prophet, Hosea.
That's right. So that's just all by itself. So we start with a hose. Number 7, Anna.
A zephyr blowing a whale into an office to see 2 hugging guys tells me that.
Okay, so what do we got there? Zephaniah precedes Haggai because he gets blown in to see those 2 guys hugging. Okay. All right. Number 8, Lily. So what are those 2? How are those 2 related, or what do we fill out here? Amos precedes Obadiah because the moose lands on the bed. So Amos goes before Obadiah. Okay. Number 9, Ashley. Yeah, it tells me what? Micah precedes Nahum. Yeah. So the mic gets put in his mouth, and he clears his throat to start speaking. Okay. Number 10, almost birthday boy. This guy's going to be 18 this week. Yeah. Okay, go ahead. Number 10.
Realizing that the 2 hugging guys are executives tells me that
Okay, so what do we have here?
Haggai
Haggai precedes Zechariah. Haggai precedes Zechariah. Okay, number 11, Blake. See how easy that is? So, all right, way to go, Blake. So whale precedes, so that's Jonah, and Jonah. First thing that happens when he lands on that bed is he's approached with that mic, and that tells me Micah. So Jonah and then Micah, and then 12, our last one here, Jeff.
A sleeping on his back whale being blown up in his bed by a zephyr tells me that Habakkuk precedes Zephaniah.
Way to go. All right. So now you've got a little bit of help, so you're not having to scurry so much in the minor prophets. If you forget one, you can turn to another, and maybe you'll remember that one. You know where you are in the line, and even just going through this, just having that picture in your head. The last thing that happens is that you're in an office space. You get blown into the office space by a zephyr. You see 2 hugging guys. The guys are executives, and one kills the other with a mallet. So right there, just that picture, you got those four last books. And so if you hear one of those books, you say, well, I know it's in that office space, so it's got to be one of the 4 last. And so then you're kind of there already. If you land in one of those 4, then you can fish your way around there. Okay, good job with that. So being the first major prophet, that means he comes after the what we call the poetry books. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, the 5 poetry books. So you have 5 poetry books followed by 5 major prophets. And then you got a dozen minor prophets after that. Okay. Let me get us to Isaiah here. So we had talked about this last week. Isaiah has a threefold outline that's helpful for us. And so then I like this outline because then Isaiah is a big book. It's 66 chapters. And wherever I am in Isaiah, I think, okay, where am I in this 3-point outline? And the outline's not tricky to remember. It's just the first 6 chapters are what? Anyone happen to remember or know this? Yeah, it's an overview of Isaiah's message. So you kind of get all that's going on. in Isaiah in those first 6 chapters. Chapter 6 is that call that Isaiah has that you might be familiar with, where he looks up and he gets the vision of heaven, and he sees the angelic host, and they're crying out, "Holy, holy, holy." And Isaiah, God says, "Who shall I send for me to my people?" And Isaiah says, "Send me." That's chapter 6. So it's kind of funny because it's chapter 6 that you get the call of Isaiah. You might expect that in chapter 1, right? But it's chapter 6. So the overview of Isaiah's message is 1 through 6. And then you can just think through, for the rest of Isaiah, you can just think through the history of Israel and that timeline. Who's the one who's bought after the Philistines? So think Philistines, think David. But once you get to the prophets are speaking to a divided Israel, and the Philistines are much more in the background. They still exist as a people, but they're really not the ones who are bothering God's people anymore by the time the minor prophets come around. Philistines bother Saul, they bother David, but even with Solomon, the Philistines really aren't an issue anymore. And so we go into the next hassler of God's people is whom? The Assyrians, yeah. Okay, so the Assyrians are the next major world power. And that's what Isaiah's message is about. Isaiah's living during Assyrian dominance. He's living during the 700s. And so if you remember in your outline, you've got the Syro-Ephraimite coalition. And even though that's Syrians and Aram, what happens is the king of Judah reaches out to Assyria, which from your perspective, Assyria is up here on the map. So these guys are coming down against him. He reaches out to these guys, Assyria, to help him. And he gives money from the treasury and even from the treasury of the temple. Whoops. To get an alliance with Assyria so that Assyria will help them in that coalition. But Assyria is the nation that comes around Jerusalem during Hezekiah's day and surrounds it, and then they cry out to God, and they wake up the next morning, and the Assyrian army is dead. Okay, so that's when Isaiah is living. Isaiah's whole lifetime is during the Assyrian crisis, and that's 7 through 39, chapters 7 through 39. So big hunk is Isaiah's response to the Assyrian crisis, or crises. You have 2 major crises, which you've learned. The first is in 734. And what's that crisis that occurs? The Syro-Ephraimite coalition under the period of Assyrian dominance, when Ahaz, the king of Judah, reaches out to Assyria, which he's not supposed to do, for help. And then you've got 701. What's the second major Assyrian crisis? The Sennacherib invasion. Sennacherib is an Assyrian, and he's king of Assyria, and he comes and he surrounds Jerusalem. So 7:1 through chapter 39, 7 through 39, are Isaiah's response to the Assyrian crisis. And you find the Sennacherib invasion in chapters 37 through 39. The very end of this section is where we see that surrounding of Jerusalem by Sennacherib. Okay? And so that's actual narrative there. 37 through 39, instead of the more usual in the prophets, you've got these, what they call oracles or speeches. Woe to you, Israel, for you do this and you do that and you do the other thing. Therefore, God will do this, or this is what God declares. That's the normal stuff in the prophets. But sometimes the prophets give us narratives. And Isaiah 37 through 39 is narrative. It's almost word for word what we have in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, almost word for word. There are a couple of word changes in there. And so that's the middle section of Isaiah. And so knowing the history, after the Assyrian crises that Isaiah responds to in chapters 7 through 39, he looks forward to something that begins to happen during Hezekiah's day, around 700, after the Sennacherib invasion. As the next nation starts to rise, they're not rising yet, but they send envoys to Hezekiah to visit Hezekiah. And Hezekiah kind of gets them in his favor by showing them all the treasures of the palace and the temple treasury and all that kind of thing. And it looks like he's trying to form an alliance with this nation to protect him against Assyria. And this is going to be trouble in the future for God's people. And that's what the third section of Isaiah is. Instead of Isaiah's response to Assyrian crises, it becomes Isaiah's response to the what? What new nation? Yeah, the Babylonian crisis. And so he speaks forward to what will happen. And it's again, IHC's, it's a potential future. And depending on how evil or repentant God's people are, they can push this back a long time, or they can kind of have it happen right now. If they're wicked, they'll have these things happen right now. If they're good and repentant, then they can push them off longer. But God has his good plans, but it'll come. And so it actually, happens about 100 years later. So they push this off quite a long time, which is interesting. So 40 through 66 is Isaiah's response to the future Babylonian crisis. So Babylon's on the scene, but could come against them, with any quick change of events. As it turns out, the Babylon conquers Assyria in 612. Okay, and the first deportation is what year by Babylon of Judah? 605. Yeah. So 612 is when Babylon conquers Assyria in a decisive battle, and becomes the major power of the region, the whole Middle Eastern area, including Egypt. Okay, so that's our threefold division. And so when you're in Isaiah, you can say, where am I? If you're in chapter 5, you're in the overview. If you're in chapter 11, you're talking Assyria. If you're in chapter 40 or later, you're talking the Babylonian crisis and the return from the Babylonian crisis, the return from exile as well, you see in Isaiah. So the return is in the Babylonian crisis part.
Throughout 40, chapters 40 on.
Not throughout. It's just, and sometimes, and good, I'm glad you asked that question. When you're in the prophets, and I was talking to one or two of you about this before, the prophets are, if you're familiar with Revelation is just a prophet book, but it's in the New Testament. And so if you understand Old Testament prophets, when you read Revelation, you say, oh, I get it. You talk about something, you go on to something else, and then you go back to the first thing. And you talk about it in a different way. And then you skip the next event, and you go and talk about a further event later. And so in Revelation, you've got 7 repeats of essentially the main structure in Revelation is ascension of Jesus to return of Jesus. That's your main structure. And you go through that about 7 times in the book of Revelation. Sometimes you go a little bit before the ascension. Sometimes you go after the ascension. But basically, that's what carries you through the book. What happens from the ascension to after the return is what I meant to say at the end of that. Chapters 21 and 22 are all after the return, most of 20. But the prophetic books are like this. And so you see God saying, I'll come to you and I'll speak tenderly to you. And then the prophet will go back into, but woe be to you because here's what you're doing right now. And I'll come against you in judgment. But he had just spoken about the return right before that. And so you're always just looking at, that's why it's so important why we do the timeline. If you know the historical timeline, then you say, oh, the prophet is in a judgment speech right now. This is a judgment speech or a judgment oracle right now. He's recounting the sins of the people, and he's giving a sentence. Therefore, I will do this, and things will be like this for you. And so when you see that, you know you're not in restoration. You're in, he's judging his people while they're still in the promised land and giving them their potential future if they don't repent. Okay. And so to answer, your specific question, Matthew, you see this throughout 40 through 66. You see restoration oracles and then judgment oracles about right now, what's going on in Israel and why God was going to judge them for the things they were doing right now. And then you go to, what their exile is going to be like. And then another judgment oracle of what they're doing right now. And then an oracle or a speech, a sermon essentially of that God will not abandon them forever and he'll bring them back. And so kind of pops around just like Revelation does. And don't think this is too unusual. We do this in conversation. You do this in conversation throughout your day. If you clocked your conversations from the time you woke up to the time you went to bed, you would see yourself talking about various eras of time. Going back, jumping back and forth. You'd be talking about, oh yeah, tomorrow I'm going to do this. And say, why is this here? You'll say, oh, well, yesterday it was this. And you say, wait a minute. If you try to take that chronologically, you'll go crazy and you won't understand the speaker. And so just understand the way the prophets are speaking, going back and forth from future to past to present and not in order. We are doing that in our daily communication verbally all day long. It's just we're smart. And we recognize when someone starts talking about, oh, yeah, that was when I got home last night, I just threw my clothes on the floor. That's not a prediction of the future. You take the cues, right? Even though he had just said before, he said, yeah, when I got home last night, I threw my clothes on the floor. The thing he said right before that is, I'm going to go to the beach 2 weeks from now. Okay? So we just recognize, so as you're reading, just like you do in Revelation, don't say, well, wait, he talked about this, so this has to be the chronologically next thing. It's not. Pay attention to what it's saying, and then say, where does this fit in the historical timeline? Because we have the historical timeline. We know when God's people are still in the land and doing wickedness and on the precipice of having a foreign nation come in. We know what happens when the nations come in. And so when we're reading in the prophets and it's talking about this nation will come in and burn down this or run over your, we have that in the history in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And so we can say, oh, okay, this is Isaiah talking about this before it happened. But I know what happened because it's in the past and I've read the history of it. So that's what we're doing there. So those are the three things there in this outline that we're looking at. Next week, what we'll do is we'll take a look at just some of the. We'll take a look at We'll look at three different passages that represent these three different periods, and then we'll be done with Isaiah. Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and pray.